Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the CSBG Organizational Standards webinar, Part 1. I'm Peggy Gleason, Administrative Project Assistant for Community Action Partnership of Oregon. Many of you may be familiar with our presenter, Ken Ackerman. Ken's the creator and manager of virtualcat.org, which was launched in 2002 through OCS funding. Ken has been a great resource for community action agencies around the nation. His involvement with community action began in 1971 as a VISTA volunteer in rural Virginia. He also served as executive director of a community action agency in the Monticello area of Virginia for almost 25 years after initially working as the agency's chief planner. Ken is a certified peer reviewer for the Award for Excellence, Pathways to Excellence in Community Action, and has provided interim management assistance and direct PNTA to community action agencies across the U.S. CAPO is very pleased to offer Ken's webinar. This presentation is supported by funding through Oregon Housing and Community Services, CSBG funds. I'd like to go over a few things before we start. First of all, we have muted all the attendees to avoid feedback problems. For audio, you have the choice of using the telephone call-in number or your computer microphone and speakers. When using your computer, a USB headset is recommended. You can switch between telephone and computer audio at any time during the webinar. And if you're having trouble hearing or viewing the presentation or wish to ask a question, you can do so by typing a message in the question area at the bottom of the control panel. Click on Send Message to Staff, and then click on Send. I'll respond to any questions that I'm able to during the presentation, and Ken will pause the presentation occasionally to answer questions specifically for him. Ken will also allow time for questions at the end of the webinar, and if you prefer to ask a question at the end of the presentation by using audio, click on the Raise Hand button on the Grab tab at the top left of your control panel, and I will unmute you. There will be a copy of the full presentation sent out by email after the completion of the webinar, and this will include live links. At the end of the webinar, you'll also be prompted to fill out a short survey. Please take a minute or two to offer your feedback. It's very important and helpful to us in planning future webinars. I'll go ahead and hand over the controls to Ken, and I hope you all enjoy the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Peggy. Welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to share information with you on the CSBG organizational standards. We hope that this presentation will give you some further insights on the scope of the standards, what each one involves, as well as some resources that can help your agency both comply with the standards as well as move beyond compliance toward excellence. As we go through the webinar, it would be really helpful if you would make notes of any particular standards that you feel you would like further information on. This is going to be a quick overview, being that we only have 90 minutes to cover 27 standards. However, there are a lot of resources that you'll be able to access afterwards. I hope you'll use them. I hope you'll share them with others in your agency who are involved with the process of assessing and then working to comply with the standards. You have my contact information on the opening slide. Please feel free to get in touch through email or phone if needed. I would like to thank OHCS, particularly Carrie Bauer, for her input into putting this material together. As you probably know, the organizational standards are being administered through the state CSBG offices. So if there are any particular questions related to Oregon's reading of what compliance or what documentation might entail, certainly OHCS will be available to you, I'm sure, on a continuing basis throughout the process. So moving into an overview of the webinar, I'm pretty sure that everyone on the session today has had a fair amount of exposure to what the CSBG organizational standards involve. I will start by making sure that whoever works on this has access to the information memorandum that released the standards, so that will be really a quick slide at the beginning. Then spending a little bit of time on the range of tools that are available through the Community Action Partnerships Center of Excellence on the organizational standards. I'm guessing that In many cases, you've seen some, if not all, of these tools, but I'd like to take some time to go over what they provide and how to access them. Again, perhaps for those who haven't had an opportunity yet to do so. Finally, today's webinar is covering the first 5 categories under the standards. And we are having a follow-up or a second part to this webinar in 2 weeks where we'll cover categories 6 through 9. And in going over the standards, I'll be sharing with you the technical assistance guides and webinars that have been compiled, some assessment scales that you can find in those technical assistance guides that will help you as you do your agency self-assessment to see where you fit on the continuum of meeting the standard. We'll be going over them as we go through each standard. Finally, the types of documentation that are suggested to indicate your compliance with each standard, and some resources then to help you in that effort as well as going beyond. Before I move on to the national tools, I'm going to do a quick poll just to help me get a glimpse of your involvement with your organization and perhaps then with the standards. So there's a poll that should be showing on your screen now. If you would please, let's ask you to check whichever one of those options fit your role with your agency, and that'll help me get a glimpse of that. Thank you. Okay. Okay, almost everyone has taken one of the options there. I'll give you a couple more seconds. Excellent. You have over 90% voting. That is a really good turnout. I wish all of our elections were like that. So what I'm seeing on the results here, let me see if I can share that with you. Okay, and you should be able to see them. We have about a quarter of the participants in the webinar today are the executive director or CEO of the organization. 3% are board members, so I'm glad to have some representation from the boards. Certainly the executive director, CEO, and board are the points of responsibility to make sure that these standards are implemented completely through each organization. So I'm glad to see that level of participation. Finance, HR, and planning. Certainly there's some categories that relate directly to those areas of involvement. And then no surprise that we have a good amount of other administrative staff and program managers who certainly will be involved in different aspects of the assessment and working toward compliance. So let's take a look at the organizational standards. Again, I'm fairly certain that this is not brand new for you, but they were officially issued just over a year ago, January of 2015, through the Community Services Block Grant Information Memorandum 138. You can access the IM directly through the link that you see on your screen. And I made a point of showing that for private agencies, private nonprofit, there are 58 standards in total. On the other hand, for public agencies or departments, as it were, there are 50. So they basically parallel each other. However, 8 of the standards that affect private agencies do not apply to the public agencies. Today, only one of those will be presented, and I know where that one is. So as we go through the webinars, I'll be showing the ones that are not applicable to the public agencies. I think the groupings for the standards and the categories in particular are very useful to be mindful of. There are 3 primary groupings you see on your screen: maximum feasible participation, vision and direction, and finally operations and accountability. And I believe if you keep those groupings in mind, it will give a good degree of logic to how this all flows and the framework that it offers for agencies really to not only comply with standards, but to move ahead into stronger efforts in all of these areas, both organizationally and as a network for our entire network of agencies throughout the United States. So the national tools that you can access through that link at the top, COE Develop Tools, each of the following slides will present one of the areas that are bulleted underneath. So when I get to the slides, next few slides, you just need to go back to this one and open up that link. I purposely didn't put direct links to the documents from the National Center of Excellence, largely because if any of them do become updated or modified, I want to make sure that as you use them, you'll have the latest versions of them. One, in fact, was updated, one of the technical assistance guides, since I started developing the webinar. So just use that link at the top. And now we're going to go through each of these national tools. First of all, the organizational standards are available. You saw them on the previous slide. Self-assessment tools that agencies will be using, as well as the ones that the states have. They're pretty comparable. Glossary of terms that you might refer to as you both do your self-assessment and work toward compliance. A different schedule of actions that you'll see momentarily. How the organizational standards fit in with the responsibilities of community action boards. The technical assistance plan tracking form that I believe will be used by OHCS. And finally, a state assessment template. Similarly, OHCS, I believe, will be using that. So the core of the information and material I'm sharing is coming from the technical assistance guides that the Community Action Partnership developed. And accompanying each guide is a webinar. There were 10 webinars, well, I'm sorry, there were 9 webinars, one for each standard. And basically, those webinars for the first 5 standards took almost 5.5 hours. So you're getting this information in 1.5 hours. So I strongly encourage you, if you have particular categories or standards within categories that you'd really like to dive deeper into, to take a look at the webinar for the respective category. And in bringing that up, I have another poll I'd like to go, and that is to see to what degree you have already accessed some or all of the technical assistance guides and webinars. Simple yes, no question. Have you accessed some of this material? Okay. Very interesting split. It's almost down the middle, so that's interesting. And again, one more person votes, so to speak, or gives their selection, we'll have over 90%. There we go, we did it. Okay, great. Give you a couple more seconds. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good perspective then, showing that we have almost an even split. So that's fine. That's part of the objective of this session, is to give you the awareness that these materials are available, and hopefully that you'll be looking into them. So the first one happens to be the self-assessment tools. There are separate tools for the private nonprofits and for the public agencies. Again, they're pretty much the same, except that 8 of the standards won't be included with the public ones. So on this particular tool, I think it's very clean and simply set out. It shows you at the top, of course, which standard each page relates to. It gives you some basic guidance on what is intended by the standard itself. You can refer to the technical assistance guides for more detail on this, but it's a good start. And then a simple checkbox. Do you believe you've met this standard or not? And if you have met it, what documentation do you have that provides evidence of complying with the standard? There are several open areas where you can put some notes in terms of if you haven't fully met the standard, where you are on meeting it. Are you needing to start from scratch, or do you have a good part of it already in place and need to cross your T's and dot your I's? And then how you will proceed to finalize meeting the standard. I like the last section, and what I would encourage part of that to be used for is, if you've met the standard, how about thinking about ways that you could go beyond just the basic compliance? In other words, you'll see on the continuum that I share with you that it goes beyond meeting the standard. It goes to actually being outstanding in terms of addressing each particular standard. So I'm going to do another poll. I hope you're not getting tired of these polls, but this will be the last one for a while. And what I'm curious about, whether or not your agency has started or completed a self-assessment. And I realize in Oregon this is something that's in progress, that not all agencies necessarily are in the mix doing that right now. So let's see how we are today with those of you on the webinar. Okay. Very impressive. 83% voted. A few more. Let's push it over to 90 here. I don't know if we technically should call this voting, but giving us your input, I do appreciate that. Give you a couple more seconds. Okay. So what we have is about a third have started but haven't finished, about a fifth have finished, and then 40% haven't started. So that's a pretty big span. Again, I think there will hopefully be useful material for all of you, whether you've completed it or the other end haven't started yet. And those of you who've completed, again, make some notes of areas that you particularly feel would be, I'm sorry, I didn't share that. There you go. There's the result of that poll. Areas that you feel you would like some further information about. Okay. I mentioned briefly on the slide with the bullet points that there is a glossary available, and it's under each category. It gives some good definitions if you're curious or confused, let's say, about what exactly might be intended by a particular word or phrase. Refer to the glossary. And then there are two calendars of required actions. There's an overall calendar, which you see on the right here, and it's really very succinctly organized by separating the standards into which ones need to be addressed and then maintained on a continuing basis. Which one needs to be addressed on a periodic basis, either less than or up to a year at a time. Then they go by, the calendar goes by dividing these standards into different increments in terms of every 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, which you'll see as we go through the standards. So I would feel this is a critical working document to use and building out for your agency to see how you're going to keep on top of meeting the particular deadlines and requirements. Then there's an entire body of information available for community action boards. This is where I talked about 10 videos. It's actually the videos for community action boards. There are 10 of them. One is an introduction to the organizational standards, and then the other 9 logically fit, one for each of the 9 standards. They average about 8 minutes in length, so it's not a huge commitment of time, but it's a really good overview. In fact, even though this says for community action boards, I would suggest that anyone doing work on the standards take the time to look at the video that relates to the standard or the category, as I should say, that fits into the area that you're involved with. It divides it up, as I said, into each of the 9 categories. Over on the right at the top, while it's not really readable, you can download it. It's a 2-page synopsis for boards showing what the types of changes in terms of the board roles and responsibilities that the standards fold into the process. And basically, it must be understood that the overall role of the board doesn't change in terms of its duty of care, loyalty, and obedience, but there are some changes in terms of the types of information and reports that the boards will receive, the types of approvals that the boards must institute in order to stay on track with the standards. So it's 2 pages, very worthwhile to look at, both as staff involved in those areas as well as the board. And finally, the calendar of board actions at the bottom separates the standards under each category that particularly relate to board responsibilities. And then finally, we have the material that state CSBG lead agencies will be using. It's my understanding, again, that OHCS will be using this material from the Center of Excellence. There is the self-assessment showing each of the standards that get assessed over periods of time, similar to the calendar, divided annually, 2, 3, 5 years, and so on, as well as those that are maintained. You can look at that and see how that is put together. And then finally, the technical assistance plan tracking form in terms of agencies that have unmet organizational standards, how the technical assistance will be developed to support meeting the requirements of those particular standards. So those are 2 documents for you to research as well. So let's move into the standards here and start with the first category, under maximum feasible participation, and that is consumer input and involvement. Basically, I'll have a cover slide for each category that lays out all the standards under that category, 3 in this one, and then gives you direct links to the toolkit, or technical assistance guide, as it were, to the webinar recording for this category, and then to a copy of the slides from the webinar. Each of the technical assistance guides start off with a similar body of information. In effect, giving some overview of how to carry out the review process for your agency to assess where you are with the standards under this category, to help you then understand there's some good text and narrative within each guide to help you understand what the background is on how these particular standards were created and what the different terms are that you'll find in the standards themselves. There is then a range of materials under each one that you can use to keep on file in an organized form. Okay, so you want to make sure you're very much on top of this when you get monitored. Excuse me. And finally then, as I've said a few times, what can you do not only to comply with the standards, but to go beyond? There's a continuum that you'll see in a moment on each one to benchmark where you are, and then to access resources to actually go further. And there it is. So you'll only see this on Category 1 right now. I have not repeated it on all the others. But in the back of each technical assistance guide, you have these assessment scales broken down for each standard. If you notice in the middle, and that's the one that's highlighted in sort of a, I guess it's a bluish color, what it is exactly that the standard requires in order to comply. That's right in the center. And if you fall on the left, it means you have work to do. And hopefully everyone is motivated, if not already, to move toward the right to go past satisfactory toward the last part being outstanding. So standard 1.1, the organization demonstrates low-income individuals' participation in its activities, is really fundamental to the entire core, in my opinion, of what community action was developed around back in 1964 and has continued to emphasize in terms of the uniqueness of our network and the importance of being a locally driven organization, basically being responsive in a new way, a unique way to the people who are intended to be the beneficiaries of the results of the work that community action, people in communities are involved with. And that is maximum feasible participation. So if you read the standard carefully, and I'm sure you'll get used to doing this each, how do you demonstrate low-income individuals' participation in what you do? So look down under documentation, and you notice that there are various ways to do that. Certainly it starts with the board of directors. If you're successfully complying with the tripartite board and keeping your low-income sector positions filled in an appropriate way, that is one form of complying with the particular standard. But there are other ways as well, going beyond board membership in terms of other policy groups, advisory groups that you might have in your organization. Certainly those agencies with Head Start have Head Start Policy Council, probably parent committees as well. You probably work with tenant groups. You have volunteers involved with your agency. You may have volunteers involved on committees within your organization as well as directly in the work that you're doing. And you may also have some community leadership efforts to help build the capacity of low-income residents to participate with your agency and with other efforts within the community. So there are a lot of ways to demonstrate this. And you can see, I'm not going to go over each form of documentation, but this is here for you for reference purposes. Okay? And then resources. You'll notice when I get to the slide for resources on each standard, there's an asterisk by the ones at the top. These are the ones that are contained within the technical assistance guides. And then I've added some ones below that I felt would be useful to share with you as well that also relate to each of the standards. So feel free to open any of these links. I suggest looking at a variety of sources in some situations. The first one here from the Community Action Partnerships Award for Excellence comes out of Community Action Agency in Idaho that received that award, and there's a portion, a couple of pages in there Toolkit showing how they involve low-income community members in their agency. One thing that they did that I thought was interesting, at their board meetings, they would periodically schedule a presentation from either a low-income neighborhood organization or another community service organization, human service organization, that primarily serves the low-income community. So that was just one of several strategies that they used, and that then gave them a lot of other connections that helped them in other facets of the work that they do. You notice there's a couple of areas here. I've included some material on recruiting low-income board members, as well as on developing community leadership, both from community action agency perspective as well as others. Okay, standard 1.2 is that the organization analyzes information collected directly from low-income individuals as part of the community assessment. Again, break this down. You want to be analyzing, first of all, you want to be collecting the information from the low-income residents in your community. You want to analyze it, and then it needs to be plugged into your community assessment. So if you look at the examples of documentation, and as we go through, you'll see that it breaks out the documentation for each of the pieces of the standard. So as I mentioned, you see the three parts here, that you're getting input from low-income community residents and groups. You can be doing it through interviews, community forums, focus groups, and so on. That you then document the methodology of how you do that. You incorporate that into your community assessment. And finally, you have some documentation that you analyze that information. And one big suggestion here is to basically create a key findings or recommendations that come out of that data that you collect from low-income residents as part of your community assessment. And here are a few resources, both from the partnership, the first three, and then many of you, or some of you may know, I did a webinar last November for CAPO on community needs assessments. You can access those slides, and in particular, a good number of them included survey instruments and focus group packets. You can see slides 27 through 43, so you can access more resources on there. And finally, standard 1.3 under this category is that the organization has a systematic approach for collecting, analyzing, and reporting customer satisfaction data to the governing board. This is something new that isn't necessarily in place universally, and that is, one, collecting the data, certainly analyzing as part of that, and then lastly, reporting it to the board. So this is a new area for the board and maybe for your agency overall. In doing that, you have three pieces to it: putting a system and strategy in place, collecting and analyzing the data, and reporting it to the board. There's no prescribed way to do this. You can use surveys. You can basically distribute them periodically throughout your agency's programs, or perhaps you want to have a rotating schedule to do it. There are some agencies that are involved in this. You'll see on the next slide already, and you can use or adapt some of the instruments that they've developed for that. Usually the analysis of the data is by staff and then reported to the board, either in written or verbal format, and certainly documented in the board minutes, which is a key for many of these standards. So here are some resources for you. The second one down, we go back to the Eastern Idaho Community Action Partnership and how they've approached this particular standard, the winner of the Award for Excellence in 2012. And if you keep going down, you'll see there are sample client surveys. I've put together probably, I don't know, 8 or 10 that you can open up and see how agencies have constructed that. Down at the very bottom, it's an interesting approach that a community action agency in Minnesota actually worked with a local university to do a full customer satisfaction review of a particular program. So that's one way to do it, is to get a third party to work with you on this. And then analyzing the data, certainly you can look at the data itself directly, but also looking at trends over time, having certain benchmarks would be part of that. So it's a very useful process, an important one to make sure the work that you're doing is really reaching the people in the ways that you're anticipating. Okay, we're moving into category 2. That is consumer input and involvement, community engagement. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes and I didn't change. Community engagement. This slide is very much related to the slide for category 1, where again you see all the standards. There are 4 under community engagement. You have your link to your toolkit and webinar reporting and webinar slides. The first standard really relates directly to Roma Goal 4 related to partnerships, and that is that you have documented or demonstrated your partnerships across the community. And here's where it gets a little deeper than the Roma Goal, and that is for specifically identified purposes and includes other anti-poverty organizations. And where I'm going with that is it's not just listing out your partnerships, which is part of the IS report, but it's going beyond that and actually documenting what each partnership is established to accomplish. What are the purposes of your partnerships? And you may have other partnerships that don't fit this standard in this way that you want to keep track of for various reasons, but the ones that you really have strategically put together a higher level of partnership, that's, I believe, where this is really settling in. And if you look at the documentation, you can see that it includes having formal memorandums of understandings or contracts or agreements. That's not necessarily going to happen in all cases, but it is one way. Looking at the mission statements of some of the organizations to indicate that, in fact, they are related to the work dealing with poverty. And then having some brief descriptions of what the purpose of the partnership is. So certainly there are various ways to do this. You can have shared projects with other groups. You can be part of a coalition. We did a webinar, and I think we're repeating it in a couple of months on collective impact. If you have shared goals, that you're part of a community collaborative, looking in that fashion, that would be another significant way that you're coordinating different kinds of projects, whether it's workforce development, economic development, and so on. So there are many, many partnerships. And looking at the resources, the partnership collaboration checkup with their toolkit and webinar. But the second one in particular is one that I put on virtual CAP quite long ago. In fact, it was in the early phase of developing virtual CAP, and that is a partnership tracking tool that came out of Community Action Inc. in Kansas. And it really is a very good spreadsheet. It's just a one-page spreadsheet that in some ways forces strategic thinking as to what are the different levels of partnerships that not only you may have now, but you may pursue to really advance the work that you're doing and to link with groups in your communities. And by the way, there's these slides to the Collective Impact webinar from last year down at the bottom. Okay, Standard 2.2. This basically is about gathering information from key sectors of the community and assessing needs and resources during your community assessment process, as well as other times, I guess I should say. But what's unique about this is that it spells out a minimum of 5 areas of including this in terms of gathering information, 5 foci, that's the right word, of the groups that you're going to be gathering information from: community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, private sector, public sector, and finally educational institutions. So this has to be built out. I would certainly suggest as part of your assessment planning, and that is for your community assessment, to do some type of grid looking at these different groups in each area and how you would in fact reach out to them. So in fact, when you look at documentation at the bottom, it talks about listing them organized by sector, summarizing the process you went through, and also I'm having trouble here. Okay, the second bullet looks almost the same to me, but summarizing what that process brought forth. And then indicating how you use that as part of your needs assessment ultimately. These all came from the Partnerships Toolkit, SurveyMonkey survey designs for gathering input. NASCASP has their Comprehensive Needs Assessment Guide. And finally, the Missouri CAP Association and CSBG office put together a toolkit which particularly talks about gathering data in different ways. So all of those are very helpful. Okay, 2.3 is communicating your activities and results to the community. And quickly going down to the bottom, you can see the forms that are used often in terms of annual reports, social media, keeping all that on file, news releases, events in the community, and so on. And I would strongly encourage the last bullet, and that is developing a structured communication plan for your agency. And there's some good resources to help you with that. So if you look at the asterisk one from the Technical Assistance Guide, you see quite a bit on social media, telling your story. The California State Community Action Association put together a planning guide, which is very helpful. And going on down. After the ones that have the asterisks with them, there's a description on virtual CAT for strategic communications planning that has some really good resources in them. I'd strongly encourage looking at that. And then looking at some return on investment reports, which I've also gathered. One fairly recent one that was done was at Minnesota Community Action Duluth a couple of years ago. One in Virginia, Total Action for Progress Community Action Agency, put together an economic impact statement and had a third-party evaluation of their Head Start program, which really is impressive. And finally, Oklahoma has put together statewide economic impact reports, both collecting all the data throughout Oklahoma, as well as then breaking that down to show the economic impact on a local community action agency basis. So you can access any of those that you might find to be of interest. The last one there on virtual CAP, for gosh, the past 5 or 6 years now, we've been gathering annual reports from around the country. And they're organized by year and by state. So please feel free to go on, open them up, of course, and see if any of them appeal to you in terms of doing one if you haven't, or maybe ideas on how you can approach yours in the future. Okay. Standard 2.4, and that is documenting your volunteers and your volunteer hours. Pretty straight up. It's not new because it is part of doing this now under the National Performance Indicators. So both the number and hours, and I would suggest expanding that to looking at the value. And if you look at the far right in the continuum, looking on the return of investment of volunteer hours. So that's a good one. There are some approaches that have been used in Nebraska. The Community Action Partnership with Lancaster and Saunders counties in Lincoln, Nebraska has a volunteer management website. You can go on that. There's a link there, the second one down, to the hands-on network calculating economic impact of volunteers. And we do have on virtual CAP, I visited Clackamas County Social Services a number of years ago and gathered information on the volunteer connection under that agency. So there's a lot of good resources right there in Oregon to see how that's being approached through Clackamas County. And you can see then there's some other general resources, including some volunteer management software that you might consider. Capterra, excuse me, the very last one, is not selling anything, but they're a good resource. They gather different options and present it so you can see what's out there and what might be useful to you. Okay, category 3, which is the last one under maximum feasible participation area. There are 5 standards. Again, you'll have your toolkit, webinar recording, and webinar slides. Okay. And I'm having a little hard time. I noticed there's some comments coming in, so I'm not ignoring them, but I just noticed someone mentioned that there's Curry County MRC And CERT programs use the hands-on network calculator to determine ROI for volunteer activities. So that's a resource that was on the last slide up at the top there, second one down, which won the agency, Carol Douglas. Thank you for submitting that if you need more info to follow through on that. Okay, so back to 3.1. I finished the, I'm sorry, bouncing back and forth, the basic presentation of the category and then each standard. Under Category 3, there are a total of 5 standards. The first one is that you've conducted a community assessment and issued a report within the past 3 years. Basically 2 elements, one that you conducted it, you completed it, and 2 that you've issued it. So how do we issue community assessment reports? That's the second part of this. There are several suggestions under examples of documentation. One is that you have an actual copy of your report with an executive summary that you can issue for people to review and then follow up to get further the full report. You could do a webinar, or you could do a public news presentation, and so on. And it is a good idea to date the report so it can show the date they were issued. I will say that I look at news every day from community action around the country, and I pretty consistently see that agencies do press releases or press conferences that release the findings from their community assessment, and often then later on the news source will follow up as particular issues come up in the community. In fact, I saw one today. So I know in Oregon, many of you are involved with the point-in-time homeless count. There's some really good coverage of that. Hunger data is often covered, but just looking at your overall community assessment and issues of poverty would be a kind of umbrella for all of this that I'd encourage. So here you can see some of the ways to create your needs assessment, which we're going to get into in more detail through the following standards. These are resources for you to use. Okay? So standard 3.2 now gets into the actual substance of the needs assessment, that you're collecting information and then you're including data specific to poverty and its prevalence related to gender, age, and race ethnicity for your service areas. That last part is key as well. So there are 3 elements to this. Number 1, that you are collecting it in regard to those different segments of your service population: gender, age, race, ethnicity. And certainly you can look at community needs assessment reports and census data and so on to show where this type of data is available, as how to present it in a clear way to ensure that you're complying with the standard. It's important to make sure the data is current. And if you notice, that word is in the standard, includes current data. You might want to show trends, but you want to make sure you have the latest data that you can access as you're doing the report. And that it's representative of your service area. It's not good enough to do an entire service area. You should break it down more if you're serving multiple counties and so on. If you can break it down even further into target areas, target neighborhoods, that would be a way to approach it as well. Particularly, I see that as being useful for groups who are launching into place-based initiatives. And so here are some tools that you can use to pull together that resource, those resources, excuse me. Okay. Standard 3.3 is that you're collecting and analyzing both qualitative and quantitative data on your service areas as part of your assessment. Hopefully, this is not any kind of unknown to you. Qualitative data, of course, has to do with getting information directly from individuals and others in your community, other groups, to help really get some good insights in terms of people's views and impressions on what their life experiences are, what the obstacles are that they're facing, what kind of resources do or do not exist in the community. So getting that data from people directly, and then using the numbers that you can pull together from the various sources in your quantitative data to complement that and build that out then as part of your full needs assessment. You can get your qualitative data certainly in many, many different ways. There are some great tools to help you in terms of working with focus group surveys, interviews, community meetings, and so on. And then likewise, including an online tool that I'll share with you in a minute, you should know about to get the quantitative data. Again, covering your entire service area and how you depict that is really important. So I mentioned the online tool. I hope I maybe should have done a survey here to see how many of you are familiar with it, but it's free. Community Action Partnership has this available. You have to do a really quick free registration process, and you can then get data specific to the communities that you're serving. Really helpful tool. And then to expand upon that with the qualitative data and other sources of quantitative data that you have available to you through your client-based data, through local health department data, housing data, and so on. So it's a good start to use that online tool. A few other sources there, and again, the webinar from last year on needs assessment. Okay, 3.4, that your assessment includes key findings on the causes and conditions of poverty and the needs of the communities assessed. So causes and conditions. So it's not only looking at what the serious problems are, but looking at what underlies those problems, what brings them about. So for example, hunger might be a problem, or homelessness might be a problem, but what are the causes of those issues? Is it lack of decent paying or living wage jobs? Is it lack of affordable housing? So really looking deeper than just we have these issues, let's help with them. So very important to address both parts of this standard, both to comply and to have an effective strategy for your agency to make a difference in the community. It's suggested that you have a section in your report, again, with key findings to show what the needs are and what the causes are. Okay, and then also this needs to be put together through an analysis of the data, and it shows you different approaches to do that through a committee or team. I put the resources at the bottom here because it didn't have as many to start with, but basically it's carrying forward from the previous slide, a few of them. And lastly, under standard 3.5 for category 3, is that the governing board, your board of directors, formally accepts the completed community assessment. Pretty basic, making sure that a copy of the CNA document is given to the board. You might have it reviewed by a committee if you have a program or a planning committee, however you might be structured. But ultimately, the board is the place where approval must occur, and showing that in your minutes. Okay. And you can see the tools at the bottom there. So that those are the first three categories. I'm going to take a deep breath and see if we have any questions or comments at this point. We'll go through the last two categories after we see what's out there. Would anybody like to have something reviewed further? A question, comment? Don't see anything on the question box right now. I think so right now. Okay, well, we'll have another chance. Okay, we'll be going back to this after we go through the next two categories. So category 4, if you notice, there are 6 standards. It's on organizational leadership. And as we go into category 4, we're going into the new area of vision and direction. So the first 3 were maximum feasible participation, and the next 3 are going to be vision and direction. Now we'll only cover 2 of them today. Category 5 will be in 2 weeks when we do the second part of this series. Okay, there's your technical assistance guide with links to the guide, the recording, and the slides. And moving into standard 4.1. This one has to do with your board reviewing your mission statement within the past 5 years and assuring two things. One, that it addresses poverty, and two, that your programs and your services are aligned with your mission. Now, please note that when it says addresses poverty, it does not mean that the word poverty needs to be in your mission statement. Certainly you can use other references to the work that you're doing that will link it with addressing poverty in terms of you could use phrases helping low-income families and communities, helping promote self-sufficiency, economic security. There are different phrases that can connotate that in fact you are addressing poverty. And then the other thing is that the board must assure that your programs and services are aligned with your mission, So that can happen through a board committee, perhaps, or through a dialogue within a board meeting or in a work session, but it is up to the board then to assure that your programs and services are aligned with your mission. That needs to go in your board minutes in order to comply, to show, in fact, that the board carried out that part of their responsibility. Okay? And there are different ways that you can document that. So a few things that we have here for you are basically resources related to mission statements. And the last four, in fact, are ones that I've added. I've done some presentations on strategic planning and on outcomes orientation. And the first one that I have after the two with asterisks is one by David E.K. Hunter called Working Hard and Working Well. This is a great free resource. If you go to Chapter 4, there's about 10 or more pages related directly to mission goals and so on. We fit really nicely into this particular standard. And then a few other things on mission. I like the last two. I use them when I do presentations, an 8-word mission statement. Can you create an 8-word mission statement for your organization addressing poverty? It doesn't mean your ultimate mission statement will end up being 8 words, but it helps really get to some real direct thinking about what is it that we're about, what is our mission. And likewise, creating poetry in the form of haiku is kind of fun. Some agencies have done this, and it's great to see the different views that people have of the focus of their work in relation to their mission. By the way, I have a question up here, and I hope I can answer this fairly, and that is, what is the difference between a strategic plan and a community action plan? So generally what I would say is a strategic plan is a longer range plan in terms of maybe a 3 to 5 year plan in terms of what your long range goals are for your organization. A community action plan would be the 1 year component of your strategic plan, and certainly with your CSBG plan, I'm assuming in Oregon, although I'm not totally sure, that when you submit your CSBG plan, that in fact is your community action plan. Strategic plan would be more involved in terms of a longer range and comprehensive look over a 3 to 5 year period. Okay, so, and I'm open if anyone would like to chime in and clarify further. Okay, standard 4.2, and here it is, your community action plan being outcome-based. A lot of pieces to this, right? Outcome-based, anti-poverty focused, and ties to your directly to your community assessment. In fact, under examples of documentation, you see those 3 listed, and showing how that happens through your plan and different facets of that, including a logic model, which is very useful to tie all of that together. And if you notice, I continue to show you working hard and working well as part of that. Okay, 4.3 is that your community action plan and strategic plan documents the continuous use of the full Roma cycle or comparable system, which I'm guessing in Oregon there will not be one, because if it's used by the state, then each agency must use it. Okay, so again, if that needs to be clarified further, I'm open for that. But as it stands, you must document your use of the cycle or a comparable system, and you see the Roma Cycle there shown: assessment, planning, implementation, achievement of results, and in other words, collecting data and evaluation, and continuing that on a regular basis. And plus then, having the services of a Roma certified trainer to assist in that. So there's some key pieces to this. You can involve the Roma trainer in different ways. It doesn't prescribe that the trainer is with your agency from the beginning to the end, but that you have a connection with the Roma certified trainer as your agency finds it to be beneficial in terms of whether it's perhaps with strategic planning meetings, with implementation, assessing what you're doing, and so on and so forth. And there's some very helpful tools you'll see in a minute that will help you determine where this might fit in best with what you're doing. So if you look down at examples of documentation, you can see that you'll actually, let's go to the resources because it gives you a better view of this. And that is up on the left there from the Center of Excellence. There is an entire document on how to document Standard 4.3. And what that includes is a template that you can use to map out each of the portions of the Roma cycle and how your agency is actually complying with it. So in other words, as we went through momentarily a few moments ago, assessment, planning, implementation, and so on, it breaks out where in your processes are you addressing each of those phases of the Roma cycle. Is it in your community assessment, making some notes as to how you're doing that, your strategic plan, or in your agency reports. And on the right, that's a page from this document here that shows the Roma implementation checklist that the Roma trainer would pretty much be using, but it doesn't hurt for your agency to look at it in advance and see how that all gets pulled together. And that's within, you can open it on this slide, just a one-page Word document, but it's part of the larger document in the Standard 4.3 as well. There are a couple of publications that are helpful in here. Certainly IM 49, when Roma was first launched, gives some good overview of the Roma framework. And the last two are some publications on using scorecards in terms of mapping out the entire Roma process, all of the 5 stages. And then the more recent one is using a strength-based approach to implement Roma throughout your agency. So I encourage you, those of you working on Roma implementation, to do that. And by the way, I see another note here that Community Action in Washington County has 3 certified Roma trainers. And I appreciate that. I visited there as well. Renee, Bruce, hello. It's good to see you on the webinar. So certainly there are Roma trainers in Oregon, and I encourage you to make those connections. Okay. Standard 4.4. The governing board receives an annual update on the success of specific strategies included in the community action plan. So this can be done once a year. Certainly it's worth considering doing it more frequently. Perhaps if you have a board committee, you might want to have it more than once a year, maybe quarterly or semi-annually. But making sure that at least once a year the full board receives an update on the results of the work that are outlined in the Community Action Plan, and as part of the Roma Cycle, then seeing what has worked effectively and what may need to have some new kinds of thinking in terms of being successful in that work. Whoops, excuse me. Okay, and we went into 2 resources here from the Technical Assistance Guide, and you can see the documentation above. But the resources there have to do with the 2 IMs, one on the Roma framework, 49, as was just mentioned, and IM 82, which is going to come up a bunch under the next category 5, related to the roles and responsibility of community action boards. I'll leave that for now. Okay, moving on, 4.5. This has to do with succession planning, that your agency has a written succession plan in place for your CEO, executive director, that's approved by your board and contains procedures for both emergency and unplanned absences, short-term absences, as well as filling a permanent vacancy. So there are 4 elements, and you can see it basically breaks out the standard for each of those. It covers the CEO's ED position, approved by the board, emergency and unplanned short absences, as well as permanent vacancies. Again, these need to go, the ultimate approval is through the board. If you go back to that calendar of board actions, you'll see that that's on there. And this basically would be one of those that is maintained. You put it in place and you maintain it. Probably review it periodically, but one of the neat things is once you go through this process with all 58 standards and get efforts and policies and systems in place, there's a good chunk of them. I did look at that. I'm thinking, gosh, maybe a quarter of them at least that you basically maintain. And so here's some resources. I know succession planning has been in the conversation for a number of years. Hope to take advantage of these resources. You can see the first one through Transition Guides, a national group with expertise in succession planning. Specifically did one for community action, a succession planning guide. Really good stuff. In fact, there was a webinar that you can also look at from them. Part of succession planning is building leadership from within. So this particular guide here from Brown, Buckley, and Tucker, who have been linked with community action for a long time, it's worth looking at. And then finally at the bottom, through Virtual CAP, there are quite a few resources through that link. You can see the bullets underneath. There's some basic guidance from different groups around the country. And in fact, one thing I didn't list there, there is a sample of a plan from the Community Action Agency as well in there. Okay, the last standard under category number 4 has to do with risk assessment. Having an organization-wide comprehensive risk assessment completed within the past 2 years and reported to the governing board. See that a lot, right? Reported to, approved by. Look at that calendar of board actions and you'll see each of these. So basically doing it within the prescribed time frame, reporting it to the board, reporting it in the minutes. What's interesting is that the reports from the risk assessment are not public information. So in effect, you do not have to disclose the results of your risk assessment. What this involves is documenting that it's been reported to the board. It's been done within the past 2 years, reported to the board, not that you have X, Y, and Z findings. Certainly you can release parts of those that you feel are appropriate, but if you notice in the technical assistance guide, it will make note of that. But basically, it has nothing to do with distributing the results or sharing the results of the risk assessment. So hopefully, many of you are familiar with the tool the partnership has made accessible in cooperation with the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. It's an online tool, free, simple registration, as with the online needs assessment I mentioned earlier. This has a very quick registration process, which puts you through an assessment throughout your agency. This would be a comprehensive risk assessment, guarantee you, if you do it, okay? But you take a look at that and I think it'll give you some good insights. And then there are some other materials. There was a webinar that gave an overview and some guidance on using the risk assessment tool, and several others as you go down. Last year, I worked with the partnership to do a series of blogs on virtual CAP at the bottom there. And if you have areas that you feel you need to focus on related to risk assessment, take a look at those blogs that we did. The point being that in each of those blogs, there's some supplemental resources that might be useful to you. So as we look at these standards and beyond, you can see HR is on there, collaboration, partnerships around there, fiscal pieces around there, and so on. So we thought it would be good to see what the risk mitigation realm of materials might be for you to support the efforts of your agency. Okay, that is 4.6. And we are now on to 5. Let me take a deep breath again, because 5 is the biggest area. There are 9 standards under Category 5. Do we have anything new that's come in? I see there's another question on the Strategic Plan and Community Action Plan, which I mentioned earlier. The community action, well, the strategic plan is a longer range. Okay. If anyone's having trouble hearing me, I get a little message here that my mic might be. Now, if you can't hear me, you probably don't know. Raise your hand if you can hear me, if I'm cutting in and out. It should be okay. My connections all seem okay. Probably should say raise your hand if you can hear me, but I'm afraid to see people who maybe aren't listening at all. So I hope that's not the case. Anyway, this being a strategic plan, long range, 3 to 5 year plan, and the community action plan would be your 1 year annual plan. So I see a couple of hands going up. I'm taking that to mean that my connection isn't as good as it could be. Okay, is that better? Raise your hand now if you cannot hear me. Can everybody hear me? I hope. I see a note from Peggy. Does this seem better to you? Okay, I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ken, it is a little better now. It's just occasionally cutting in and out, but I can still hear you. I just wanted to make sure you had everything connected correctly.
Yeah, it's all connected. I'm moving the mic up a little bit. Hopefully that might even be better. Okay? Okay, Category 5, under Vision and Direction, takes on the critical area of board governance. There's your toolkit and so on, webinar recording and so on. Okay? So Standard 5.1, I'm sure this is old hat for every single community action agency in Oregon and throughout the country, that our governing boards are the tripartite structure as spelled out in the CSBG Act with at least 1/3, and the key phrase here, democratically selected representatives of the low-income community. And you'll be seeing this on the next standard, actually, in terms of complying with the intent of the requirement, actually, of democratically selected. 1/3 then being local elected officials or the representatives, and the remaining members from other major groups in the community. So the way to document that, of course, is showing your bylaws are compliant with the regulations that are spelled out in the CSBG Act, showing your board membership with the different sectors appearing, and finally in your board minutes as well. Okay, so there's a lot of great material on boards, and you can see some in here related to bylaws. Capitol in particular has some really good materials, of course, as most of you should know about, and others. NICWA, by the way, right below the middle here, NIQCA, is the Northeast Institute for Quality Community Action. This was a coordinated effort of the state community action associations and community action agencies in New England, and they have some good resources, including this board resource toolkit. So making sure you're up with your recruitment, but I'm going to go back a minute to make sure that your bylaws and your board, those who are seated, complies with the CSBG Act. Okay. Standard 5.2 then gets into the whole aspect of democratic selection process. One thing that's new about this is you now have to have a written procedure documenting what your democratic selection process entails for bringing low-income board members onto your board who represent the low-income community. I actually did a one-day workshop or training session with the Wisconsin Association late last year and pulled together a lot of material to help develop ideas on how to carry out a democratic selection process. So if we go into the resources, you'll see down here that I included some of those resources for you. And in particular, certainly you'll see the materials from the Partnerships Toolkit. There's a piece directly in the Toolkit for Standard 5.2 on complying with the democratic selection process. CAP law in there, major publication tools for top-notch CAAs. You need to do a search when you get in there. I would suggest putting on tripartite and then do a search in that document because there's a lot of different references in it. IM 82 spells it out as well. And then finally, the ones that I was referring to earlier that I shared with the agencies in Wisconsin late last year. I worked on a toolkit called Striving for Excellence, an annotated resource guide for community action boards. And in there, there's a module on board membership and training. And if you look in there, you can see there's some really good materials on conducting public meetings to have a low-income board member elected, creating a petition and ballot process for low-income board members to be seated, and finally having an organization that is comprised of majority of which are low-income residents as part of their organization or their programs. And basically it's important to note that these efforts select your member that the board then seats. Your board is the final point of having someone officially seated on your board, so it's not an automatic process. Your board still needs to accept those members when they're brought forth. Okay? And by the way, I do notice in many areas agencies actually do public announcements, so I compiled a bunch of those toward the bottom there you can access. And CAPLA did some case studies. Okay, so here we have the one standard that will not be relevant or applicable to public entities, and that is that your bylaws have been reviewed by an attorney within the past 5 years. So this is one of the 8 that, again, don't fit in with public agencies or departments. So this is pretty basic. You need to have an attorney review your bylaws. As you read the toolkit, it's encouraged that you have someone who is familiar with nonprofit law in your state. I know Oregon has some really good resources related to nonprofits, so you probably can link up with some of them. You certainly don't have to pay your attorney. If you can get pro bono, go for it. Doesn't mean you have to have a financial connection. But basically, you can even have someone on staff who's an attorney, which isn't that common, but maybe who could help you with. But probably not for a final review. You probably want to get a third party, an outside party, to give the review and to submit documentation that that review is completed. Okay, and then certainly present it to your board as another form of documentation. So you can use a lot of good resources, again, from CAP Law. I know CAP Law Conference is a good venue to get more information, but certainly online through these resources, there is quite a bit. Okay, in fact, about just over 2 years ago, if you look toward the bottom, they put together tips for attorneys reviewing community action agency bylaws. Okay, so in fact, if I look at this slide, every single one is CAP law, so hopefully that is useful to you. I hope you find some good guidance through those. 5.4, that you document that each of your board members receives a copy of your bylaws within the past 2 years. Not rocket science. You can simply do that. Make sure you have documentation that it's been done in terms of a schedule of when it's done, record keeping of who's received it and when it's been received and so on. So that's a good one. I can go through that one quickly. I hope you don't have too many questions on that one. Okay, standard 5.5. is that your board meets in accordance with your bylaws in terms of the frequency, quorum requirements, and filling the vacancies that are dictated out in your bylaws. So under Standard 5.5, there's no specifics in terms of how often your board has to meet, or in particular what your quorum should look like. That's up to you. It's certainly encouraged to have not to have too few meetings where the continuity and the gathering of information ends up slipping a lot. I know some agencies have large distances to cover and don't necessarily meet every month, but many agencies meet monthly. Some might miss a meeting in the summer, a meeting over the Christmas holidays, and so on. But generally making sure your bylaws spells this out and that you're complying with that. Likewise with quorum, seeing what's required in your state if there's any minimums, but in particular fulfilling what your bylaw says. And the last one, filling board vacancies, keeping on top of that is really critical in terms of having a pool of eligible board members that might be involved with your agency through volunteer work, who know your agency and can step in, or just different development of pool of people who might be prospective board members. Because when vacancies last for an extraordinary amount of time, you're going to be found out of compliance with this. So you have to have a real plan in terms of sustaining your board membership. Standard 5.6, making sure that you have a conflict of interest policy in place, that each board member signs it within the past 2 years. We have some resources here for you that you can use if you don't have one or want to build up your conflict of interest policy. Keeping it on file then, make sure you have it available for every board member, showing that they've received it, they sign off on it. And also disclosing conflict of interest, which is required as part of the super circular, right now, the OMB super circular, and IRS 990. So it's not just signing off on it, but then providing training on it and identifying any potential conflicts. So you can see here quite a few different tools about that, including model policies. The CAP law offers, and underneath that, the fifth item down, if you go to the online risk management tool, which I talked about earlier, in terms of not only doing a risk management assessment, but also there are templates there that can help you create specific policies, and indeed there is one to help you build a conflict of interest policy. So if you have a pen and if you have a copy of the handout and you circle that one, I'd say go right to it and take a look at it if you need an updated or a new conflict of interest policy. Another piece down toward the bottom, accountability of charitable organizations. I put that on Virtual CAP a number of years ago after Sarbanes-Oxley came out in response to the Enron situation, which began putting a focus on the public sector and nonprofit sector in particular in terms of transparency and accountability. And I strongly encourage looking at that because it's not only conflict of interest, but other principles for good governance and ethical practice. 5.7. Okay, this one has to do with orientation of board members. It's required to have a structured orientation for your board members within 6 months of being seated. So having a set curriculum or method of orienting your board, having documentation that orientation occurred. If a board member was offered and declines to participate, documenting that as well. And some really good materials here to help you think about the elements of your orientation. You can see in the technical assistance guide itself, there's an outline of an orientation process. And then in the Striving for Excellence guide that I mentioned earlier, down at the bottom there, you can see the bullet points. There's a board orientation checklist, a board mentor policy template, and so on, quite a few items there. By the way, speaking of orientation, I recently noticed there was a community action agency that put together a YouTube video for their staff orientation, and I'll be sharing that with you later on. We're getting human resources in 2 weeks. But that's certainly another way you can do a standing video that would be available as you're recruiting new board members, as well as when you seat new board members, and that can certainly be part of orientation. So I thought that you'll see that under HR, as I said, but you might use that as well, something similar to that, creating that for board orientation. And then we get beyond orientation in terms of, ongoing training for boards. And so basically, looking to have training for boards on duties and responsibilities within the past 2 years. That can occur in various forums. It can happen as part of a board meeting. It could be done as a standalone event. It could be done as a part of a retreat or with different groups. But basically documenting how you do that, what it involves, and keeping track of that. If you look at the resources here, you can see the Iowa Community Action Association has done a really nice board training manual that you might want to access and adapt for your use. There's also the New York State CAP Association did a webinar. Right there, you can access that. And then finally, the guide that I've been mentioning, Striving for Excellence. There's materials throughout that guide that you might want to draw from in terms of job descriptions, and so for board, that is, and other types of material. Okay, we're on the last standard here, and that is making sure the governing board receives programmatic reports at each board meeting. That may be standard procedure already for many of your agencies. This doesn't mean that they should get reports on every program at every meeting. You might rotate that around, maybe semi-annually, have each program on a rotating basis. So at each meeting you have different programs, but programs come up twice a year. You may do it through quarterly presentations, or you may just give a brief summary with follow-up conversation as well. You might use your dashboard. Remember earlier on there was a toolkit about dashboards, so that's another way to track what's up with your programs. But basically making sure on your board agenda you have something about program reports and you record it in your minutes. And we have a sample program report that in fact came out of that Striving for Excellence toolkit, but I thought why not just put the report straight in here if you'd like to look at the template for a monthly or quarterly report to the board. Okay. So those are the 27 standards under the first 5 categories. First 5 categories. I'm going to take advantage of the brief time we have left to alert you to the range of free resources you can access on Virtual CAP. That's a flyer showing all the areas. As you know, I've been with Community Action for quite a while, including as an executive director. So I thought Virtual CAP would be a great clearinghouse to help us all learn and share with each other and gain access to helpful resources. Last year, we started a new publication called Virtual CAP Roundup. Virtual CAP is now under the Ohio Community Action Association. So we put out 10 issues last year and have one in January of this year. 11 have been published. It's a low-cost subscription publication, so I'm marketing here as well. Each issue includes a focus topic, successful funding initiatives, innovative programs, community action programs, news from the network, and then related information. So I certainly hope you consider taking a look at Virtual CAP Roundup, possibly subscribing. If you do, you can access our archives, and your username and password can be shared with your staff and board and give everyone in your agency access to this range of material. And finally, you keep up with what's going on with Virtual CAP through Twitter and Facebook, and certainly going on the website. So I've kind of brought us in on time. We have about 5 minutes until 2:30. Can I have any kind of indication if you have questions or not. If you don't.
Ken, did you want to run the fourth poll?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, I got ahead of myself. So here's a good one for you. I want to hear from you, if you don't mind. This isn't going to be shared with anybody, but how do you feel about where we are now in the first five categories? How do you feel about your agency's ability to comply with the standards? Now, this is not going to be reported individually. Okay. Give you a few more minutes. If you have a question in the meantime, feel free to enter that. If you'd like to be unmuted, we can get you to raise your hand if you'd rather ask a question over your phone. Let's see how we're doing here. Okay, we have about 80%. Okay, let's just see where we are then. I'm closing out and sharing. Okay, so a few agencies look like they're in really good shape, pretty confident, very confident. Majority of folks are saying there are a few that are challenging, but should be okay, and then about 15–16% are having some more difficulties or need some help. So as a follow-up to this, if you have particular standards that you're not really strongly ready to launch into, please send me an email or a phone call or get in touch with Housing and Community Services, and we'll try to do the best we can. I don't know, does Paula Hall, I've just unmuted you. Do you have something you wanted to bring up?
No.
Okay, I'm going to mute you. Okay. Your hand was raised from earlier, I believe. Okay, and I see a comment also about Community Commons related to needs assessment compiling. Well, the Community Commons is part of the online tool, if I'm not mistaken. So in order to access, if you go on the webinar that I did back in November, there's some slides that feature the Community Needs Assessment tool on Community Commons and the different features of that, including the mapping feature as well as the data collection. That can be very much segmented by your service area and census tracts and so on within your service area. It's really good stuff. So if that's what you're referring to, that's what I would suggest. But if you have does anyone else have, you want to expand on that? So a comment on that. Please raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted. Or use your question box. Okay, Peggy, do you want to mention the evaluation again? And what?
Yes, after the webinar, we will have a short survey, and if you can all just take a minute or two to answer the survey questions, that would be really helpful to us in future planning. And also, I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have a network of 8 Roma trainers here in Oregon. And if any of you are interested in having a Roma training at your agency, please get a hold of me and we can arrange that for you.
Okay, and a reminder that in 2 weeks we're having the next part of this webinar for categories 6 through 9.
Right.
Okay. Okay,
any
so
further questions?
Last chance, going once, going twice. Well, I want to again thank CAPO and Housing and Community Services for working together to get this out there for you. And I hope this has been helpful. I look forward to hearing from you if needed and having you join us again in 2 weeks. So I guess we're going to say it's not quite afternoon for you yet. I'm on the East Coast, so I'll say good afternoon, but have a good lunch for those of you ready for that. Okay? Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.